Just a few words to introduce Chris, and then he can introduce himself. Um, Chris is a former Royal Marine Commando, which I find amazing every time I say that. And prior to becoming ill, Chris was living a high-pressured life of service and adventure, I think. And then incredibly, his symptoms began to worsen, and ME/CFS just took him down. So Chris is going to tell us all about that experience, what it was like for him, and how he discovered and then implemented the tools that led to his recovery. We know that Chris continues to serve others and has devoted his working life to developing the Freeme app, which is designed to provide online tools specifically for people with CFS and ME. I know that Chris loves to ski and that he's very happily relocated to Austria, where he can pursue his passion. And I think, Chris, you have some other exciting things in your life at the moment as well. So thank you so much for being here and for sharing your story.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for having me. Yeah, it's an honor.
So let's jump into your story, Chris. We know that you were in this very demanding leadership role in the Royal Marine Commandos. So you were certainly familiar with the fight and flight experience. I'm curious to know a little bit about your background and what drove you to a life in the military. Did that start when you were young?
I think so. I think it was those terrible but brilliant TV adverts. Do you remember the ones that said 99.99% need not apply? And for some reason, me and my brother found those incredibly exciting. Yeah, I don't know. I think it's funny. I right at the end, I wanted to kind of reflect and say that, my time in the military was incredible, like hugely rewarding, and one of the best things to ever happen to me. But I reflect a little bit differently on why I joined now, and I think I was a young man trying to prove something to the world, and that's now a lot more interesting to me than it was, and I don't think I was aware of it at the time. But yeah,
Yes.
as a young man after adventure and wanting to do something and test myself and have challenge and adventure, and I got that in spades.
Yeah, absolutely. And can you tell us a little bit about what your career was like in the military up to the point that you started to experience some symptoms?
Yeah, I can. It's the last part's a bit hard because my symptoms came on quite gradually. So I, the exact point I can't even really pinpoint, but it was somewhere in the middle of my career that I started noticing things. But I served for just over 10 years. And I mean, where to start? Training was absolutely wild, crazy. But you look back on it as it was 15 and a half months of, in some ways, misery and hell. And you look back on it in some ways quite favorably. It was also incredibly fun. You were going through this hell with a bunch of other people who had just come out of university like me. And it was the wildest adventure you were going on. So yeah, it was misery mixed with something that was hugely rewarding, and you were all going through it together. So it was in some ways incredible. I passed out, and very quickly in my career, I was always the one to volunteer to go away. So if ever anything was going on abroad, I would be the first to put my hand up. And that meant over that 10-year period, I served in 19 different countries and did 5 operational tours. And that tempo kept going up and up. I would volunteer for more and more things, try and become more and more qualified to go away more and more. And I feel very lucky and privileged about the career I had. In some ways, I was incredibly lucky not to see any hard fighting, for example, in Afghanistan, that the generation before me had experienced. And yet I had ample adventure and experience. So it was an incredible time. And when I wasn't serving, I was still doing other adventurous things. I was always pursuing other kind of adventure goals. That's probably not the right word, but I was skiing loads, as you alluded to before. And I think my season record, I managed between an operational tour and my next job, I managed to persuade the person who appoints you and gives you your jobs that I was at a loose end between these two things, and managed to get in 12 weeks skiing one season. So, incredible. I was paragliding, scuba diving. I got my private pilot's license. You can get some money to get some qualifications, and I managed to persuade them to contribute towards that. So I was just doing, anything active that I could, anything adventurous. I mean, maybe that's a good summary, but it was a good time and a period I look back on overall hugely favorably.
Yeah, I can't relate to I mean, I do remember those adverts, but certainly it passed me by the 99%. What I can relate to in your story is the finding a group of people to work with. That's where I found my 40 at work, was working with an interesting group of people and being motivated by that. And I'm sure lots of people in the group, we can have a show of hands to see who would relate to the wanting to learn more and be more qualified and that sort of drive. So you said your symptoms started to come on slowly. What sort of thing did you start to notice?
Yeah, I think I started to notice that whenever I trained hard, I would pay a price for it. And that would look like a period which I would now, most people would call it was a very early and gentle crash, if that's a contradiction in terms, isn't it? Anyone who's experienced a crash before as related as a result of one of these conditions. But I just, for a period of days afterwards, I wouldn't be able to work through a to-do list like normal. I wouldn't be able to concentrate like normal. I wouldn't be able to get things done. I wouldn't sleep so well. But that part is interesting. I would tell myself I'd slept awfully, but I'd sleep for 8 hours, and then I would still wake up feeling really unrefreshed, and then still moan to everyone about my sleep. And this would last for a few days. And I had no idea what it was at all. I would just moan more about certain things, and I just wouldn't feel great, and I'd have to ease off training for a bit, and then it would get better, and I didn't have a clue what was really going on. And that really continued for the rest of my military career. I think it would come and go. And I don't know what I honestly don't really know what I thought, but I definitely didn't think in any way I had ME/CFS. I didn't. If I'd have gone to a doctor as well, I would have been laughed straight out the room. I was still absolutely performing, but I was noticing I was different to everyone else to my left and right. And I noticed that I couldn't always do the same things. I could do it in the moment, and then I would pay this price for it. So that's really the first thing I noticed.
And did you start at that point? Were you just putting it up with it at that point and moaning to your colleagues? Or did you start to seek help at that point in the medical service, in the Royal Marines?
No, I didn't seek any medical help at all. I think I did what I do all the time, which is I was like, okay, well, there's clearly something, I'm clearly not optimized in some way. I need to, and I was already a man of extreme diets, extreme training. And I think I just thought, well, okay, well, I must be deficient in some vitamin or mineral. So I would go and take more zinc, or I would go and do something else. And then my sleep would be rubbish. So I would go online and I would make sure that my sleep hygiene was perfect, that I was, my room was perfectly blacked out, that it was cool, all of these things, and still felt awful and still felt terrible. So I think I had this general feeling that my health was getting worse and worse and worse, and that's not nice. And as your health gets worse, and then you keep doing more and more to try and optimize it and improve it, and it carries on getting worse, that's when it's not nice at all, isn't it? And I'm sure pretty much everyone in this room can resonate. It's a horrible part of it.
Yes, no, absolutely. I'm sure people would relate to that. I certainly would. And as these symptoms started to take an impact on your career, was that a big part of your decision to retire, or you had already planned to leave the service at that point?
Yeah, no, I had already planned to leave. So I left really on a high. And that last period before I left is really interesting as well. For the last 3 years, I did pretty much back to back operational tours. So I was always abroad for the last 3 years. And I was probably working, very silly hours, probably 16 hours a day, sometimes for weeks or even months on end. And I was still sustaining it and I was capable of it as well. So no, I absolutely left. I left because I wanted the next challenge and I wanted to see what I could do in civilian life. And so very much nothing as a result of my symptoms at all. I was still getting them, but I was, as I say, very, very able to perform through them. The reason I find it interesting is because I had, in some senses, a lot of stress. So you could say a hugely demanding job, 16 hours a day, blah, 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 all those things. You say that's a lot of stress. But I think there's a very important counter to my stress that was acting against it. And one of the biggest mediating factors is fun, enjoyment, reward. I had a brilliant career that I loved and I was engaged. I was distracted from everything that's going on. And I was, I was so fulfilled and my identity felt complete. I had a really strong sense of identity and purpose. I was amongst loads of people who I cared about, doing meaningful work. And so
Yep.
I think that can be one of the most powerful mediators to stress we have. And maybe we'll go on to talk about it. But, the period when I was worse is when I didn't have all those things, but I had way less stress on paper as most people would look at it. And that's really interesting, I think.
Yes, no, I can really relate to the working long hours and living overseas, which I did working on construction projects for a long time. But I don't think
Yeah.
I really had at that time in my life the balance of also seeing the need to do things that I enjoyed as well. I was
Yeah.
definitely a workaholic.
Yeah.
And did you take the same drive into civilian life? What then happened and what happened with your
Yeah.
symptoms?
Well, I left. I left, as I said, I think on a feeling, feeling good about myself and on a
Yeah.
high. I then went traveling for a few months, and I remember in that period feeling great. I think I was still on the high of leaving the military without having to in any way contemplate what was next. And so I went on basically on a series of holidays, having saved quite a lot of leave, and felt symptom free. I remember running up. We did a 2-week motorbike trip around California. Incredible, one of the best things I've ever done. And one day we were in Yosemite and we decided just to run up El Capitan and back down. And it was pretty much just, I would say run, sorry. I should definitely caveat that with a lot of the way. I don't know if anyone else has walked up it. We ran down and very much walked up the 35 kilometers up that mountain. But the next day, absolutely felt great. Back on my motorbike, feeling brilliant again. And memories like that serve as like a really interesting point. So I've left. I'm on the high point. I then have this period of traveling, no symptoms, feel great. And then I go back and I kind of settle down into what I thought was going to be my civilian life. And that's when things start getting worse and worse. And when we talk about like the different types of stress, that's why I find it really interesting, because I'm then sat at home with far less to do. And I think there are three major things that I now reflect on that I find interesting. And they're the sort of stresses, but the ones that I definitely wasn't seeing at the time. The first is the one that I've briefly touched on, which is my identity in the military. I think everything, you do have such a sense of purpose in the military, or at least I did. And then suddenly you're sat at home and you're wondering who you are, what you're trying to achieve in life, what you're trying to do next. And it's a really interesting period. And I think that I had significant stress around that. I had the end of a long-term relationship. And then the next thing I had was stress around what I wanted to do next. And I wanted to set up a business. And I wanted to set up a chain of gyms in the UK. And to do that, I was going to have to raise over £1 million in capital. And something in my body was screaming at me saying, like, this, don't do this. Like, this is incredibly high risk. And it didn't feel right and it didn't feel good. And I basically ignored that. And I said, no, this is what it's meant to feel like as an entrepreneur. That's the feelings you're meant to have. It is risky. That's what being an entrepreneur is. But my body was screaming at me to say, don't do this. And then then I say, so that I've listed 3 stresses, and then I want to add a sort of what I'm going to call a multiplier. And so when my symptoms started to come on, I was sat at home, I had no daily routine, so I could work as much or as little as I wanted. And it gave me infinite time and space to worry, to ruminate, to focus on my symptoms. And I think those stresses multiplied by that is a huge part in explaining why my condition worsened. I have that evidence that I did for those 3 years, all those things that were on paper stressful and I was capable of them, that my body's capable of doing those extreme feats. There's no biological process that I know that can store all of that, wait until you're sat at home till you've rested for several months, on paper rested, had loads of time off, and then hit you with it. And so I look at it now in that light, and not in the light of as how one might look at stress.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I think to the casual observer, that would seem like a massive change in your life, to leave this career that's meant so much to you, and that huge sense of purpose, which is so rewarding, and working with people that you really appreciate. I certainly I went off on a tangent at one point, because I didn't feel like I had a purpose. It was really a detour that I took for a long time, thinking, what meaning does my life have? It took me quite a long time to unwind that one. And then it's very interesting that you would say that the multiplier of those things, which we've all gone through, breakups of relationships, so painful, is having the time to worry about those things.
Yeah, I think the identity one is incredibly powerful, or can be, and it takes a lot of you have to be reasonably vulnerable to come out and say that. And what did that also mean about me as a person? But I think I used to feel incredibly proud, and I still do, but I used to feel proud to say, I am a Royal Marines Commander. If I ever said that, I would feel genuine pride, and that meant something to me. And the next thing, a few months later, someone might ask me what I would do, and I would say, well, I sit at home in my pants. And those two things were not the same. And that's me being completely honest. The part of my identity was very heavily linked to it, in a way that actually it was a small reason why I wanted to leave. I recognized that I didn't want my identity to be pinned to it. I think too much of that can be unhelpful, for sure. But I think you're right, it's huge.
Yeah, huge. It makes me think of when I retired from work, and I retired quite early. And when people asked me in a social setting, what do you do? I just felt full of shame to say that I had retired, and I didn't have a good answer for that at the time. Yeah.
To allow that emotion, for us to be willing to be vulnerable at that, and to realize we're feeling those things, I think is an incredible step. And one I might not have chosen to do in this setting, but I think it's incredibly important that we talk about these things, especially as men, and in a way that a military man might not typically do so.
Yeah, well, I want to circle back to that, of course, but from the comments in the chat that I see going past, people can't believe that you ever had CFS at this point. So let's move on to the darker time where things started to get worse before we turn to the outcome.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I touched on it briefly, but it started to get worse when I was back at home trying to work on this business. And I remember, I kind of make myself laugh that I still didn't really know or stop and say, hang on, this isn't right. But I remember a snapshot of my time when in my life, when I would pack every single night, and to go to the gym the next day, and I'd pack my bag and I'd have it right by my bed. And I would say, okay, well, I've removed all barriers. So first thing in the morning, I will go and train and go to the gym. And so I'd have all my stuff ready. I'd wake up and I'd roll out of my bed, and it would take me about 4 hours to get out the door. I'd have my clothes there, my gym bag here, and in theory, it's a 5-minute job to put my clothes on and leave the house. And I just couldn't do it. people who have been there will understand, but the most basic things become challenging. And I would drag myself to the gym. I'd go to the toilet, go to the locker room, and I'd lock myself in it, and I'd sleep for 20 minutes. I'd try and work out for about 10 minutes, give up, go and get changed, go to work. And I remember I was in this workspace, and I would take a towel, put it underneath my head and in the toilet, and I would go to sleep on the floor for 20 minutes. Then I'd do about an hour or so's work. Then I'd go for another nap, and I would go through several days like that. And then I would, and then I'd have days where I felt fine again. I'd be like, what on earth was that? The days I felt fine would soon get shorter, and I would be a bit paranoid. I say a bit paranoid. That's not true. I'd be extremely paranoid. I'd be like, okay, when's this next going to happen? And I remember just doing a workout at one point that just floored me. Like I came back and I just sat in my chair for about 2 hours like this immediately after it. And then the next day, most of the time it would be, I'd have to wait until the next day or two. But that time I just couldn't do anything. And yeah, I still didn't really know what was going on. I started to go to see my doctor, and went through just endless blood tests, like just starting with normal blood tests, then extra panels for all sorts of stuff. Went to have my liver screened and checked out. I did cortisol tests and short synapsin tests and stuff like that to test my adrenals and thyroid and everything. And occasionally it would just be on the edge of the normal ranges, but everything was coming back normal. And I mean, I gave up training. Obviously, that was the first thing to stop. And then I stopped working entirely. So I was just literally at home with nothing to do. And it just got worse and worse and worse. And I'd drag myself out of bed every morning at 8-9 o'clock in the morning. And then I would be able to go and sit on the sofa. And I'd eventually, by about 1 p.m., I would be well enough to actually move around the house and cook for myself and look after myself. That's really what life looked like. I was pretty much at my lowest ebb. I didn't really feel safe driving, so I would occasionally, sometimes when I felt well enough, I'd drive myself to my local park and sit there for a few hours. And then drive home. But that would be a good day. So that was really kind of rock bottom. The doctor had no answers, funny enough, he was incredibly well-meaning, nice. He was polite, but he was baffled, and he was, and there was a limit to what he could do. So I was very grateful for his help, but he wasn't able to do much.
Did he believe you that you had these symptoms?
If he didn't, he didn't ever express it. But I do remember a snapshot that I think will probably stay with me for a while. And he wrote on his, I looked over at his computer, and he was writing away, and I could see what he was typing. And he said, "Chris is off work due to stress." And I thought, like, it brings back emotion now. I was like, buddy, this isn't stress. Of course, I now look back on it, and I kind of do look at stress, but I was like, buddy, this isn't stress. Like, I've done, very long stints in Afghanistan that I would call stressful. That was stress. I'm now sat at home doing nothing. You're telling me I'm off due to stress. Like, how does that compute, add up, make sense? And it didn't at all. But no, I think he, I had told him I had stopped working due to it. So yeah, I guess he just thought it was stress maybe, but he didn't have any answers as to the biological mechanism that might actually then, floor me. And he didn't have anything he could do. Eventually he just said, he must have come to the same conclusion to me, because he said, all I can do is transfer you to a MECFS clinic. There's one locally. I was in Bristol at the time, and there was a clinic nearby, and he said, look, this is all I can do. So eventually he did come to this conclusion that I had MECFS. And at pretty much exactly the same time, I had been, like we all do, Googling this endlessly, and I'd came to the same conclusion. And that, I talked about it a few times before, but that moment is, it's odd, actually. The moment that you realize you've got one of these conditions, I think, firstly, it's hugely validating. For the first time in my life, I was able to explain, for the first time in having symptoms, I was able to explain to my friends and family and say, I have this condition, here's what it's called, it's got a name, and it comes with these symptoms. It comes with fatigue, it comes with brain fog. So, when you might think I'm just being useless or something, actually, look, I've got this condition, and that's what it comes with. So I found it validating, and that helped, I think, for about 2 weeks. And then I thought about my prognosis. I thought about what my life was going to be like. I thought that I'd never be able to go skiing again. That was my first selfish thought. And then afterwards, I started to think, the other things that matter in your life, your friends and your family. Like, can I travel and go and see them? Can I play a meaningful part in their lives? And you realize every goal and ambition you ever have is potentially not going to happen. And so, yeah, that part is horrendous, the worst. And again, I probably don't have to explain that to anybody in the room.
Yeah, no, I just want to bring so much empathy and compassion to that, Chris, that you went through that. It just must have been absolutely crushing to go from the active, amazing guy that you were to think this is my life now. And I feel like your doctor did his best, but perhaps
Yeah,
not with the context of who is Chris as a person, that he would have seen the transformation. But at
I
least he
think so.
referred you to the service.
Say it again, sorry.
At least he referred you to the MECFS service.
Yes,
But I don't think you actually went, did you?
no, I didn't. It was incredibly fortunate that at my lowest ebb, which might not be a coincidence, I found the first thing that helped. But no, I think, in fairness to my doctor, I genuinely think he was well-meaning, doing a good job as best as he could. And I don't certainly. I genuinely think he was a good person doing good.
Yeah, yeah. I think I've heard you say before that a friend had suggested you look at the Curable app, and that's what shifted your view of the symptoms. Is that what happened? Someone suggested this to you?
Yeah, it's half right, but that didn't shift my view in the symptoms. In fact, it just made me angry because I was like, I remember, I just, I don't think you understand. In my head, I was like, I don't think you understand what I'm going through, what this is. And thanks for your recommendation of an app, but it's probably not going to help. But I was also getting adverts for it at the same time. So maybe my phone was listening to me or something strange. I don't know, but I was getting adverts at the same time. And I thought, I'll check it out. Half out of curiosity, when you kind of want to understand something so you can argue back with your friend who said something offensive
Yes.
to you. And so I was curious and curious enough to try it out. And that skepticism I had was quite short-lived. It was a few days, because the first thing it tells you, of course, is that what's going on can be the result of your nervous system, and that your nervous system is controlled by your brain. And I remember even, testing everything. I was like, hang on, but I had endless notes on my phone. I was trying to track everything and trying to find a correlation between what I was doing and what was going wrong. And I had this long list of notes on my phone. And I remember being like, okay, can the nervous system really cause this? I have some weird symptoms that have come with this. I've got all the normal ones, and then, and then all sorts of strange ones. And I, one by one, I went through the symptoms and was like, into Google, can a dysregulated nervous system actually affect energy? And it's like, yeah, of course it can. That's its job, is to get us ready in extreme situations. In the past, it had put me in fight or flight mode for very good reasons and really helped me. That's its job. And then, but every single symptom, I went in line by line. Can the dysregulated nervous system contribute to the fact that I've got cold hands and feet half the time, even though I'm in a really hot room? The fact that I constantly feel like I've got a low-level cold. The fact that, I've got brain fog and I can't think through things. The fact I've got no memory. And when every single symptom, and of course, time and time again, it would come back and be like, yes, of course it can. The nervous system is the master control of the body, and it can affect every system. And then I think I was like, okay, well, what if that's the case? Then what controls the nervous system? Like, what inputs does it have? And of course, it's like the brain. And you're like, oh, okay, yeah, I feel a bit silly. But I mean, so that skepticism, I think, was relatively short-lived. But it wasn't actually. Well, it was two things. It was a scientific explanation of what was going on. And that explanation was the first one that genuinely held up to all of my scrutiny, and it explained everything. No other explanation had been the complete explanation. It made sense in every part. And then I think that probably even more importantly, I started to feel huge relief incredibly early. And I think the biggest thing, well, there was a lesson super early on in the app that really helped me, that talked about how we respond to our symptoms. And when I first listened to it, I was like, okay, great, but it isn't me, because it describes, responding to your symptoms with fear. And if people have been in this world for a little while, they know that's the thing. But when I heard that, I said, responding to my symptoms with fear, that's not me. Again, I've known fear, and I've been scared of things in the past, and I'm not scared of my symptoms. But I realized very quickly it would have the same pattern, right? I would hear something in the app or in a book I was reading, and then I would say, no, that's not me. And over the next few days, I would just notice something. I would become aware of something I was doing, the way I was responding to something. And I would be like, that's interesting. I've told myself I'm not responding with fear, but here I am, worrying about this next symptom, worrying about when I'm next going to crash. Here I am Googling this new symptom that's come on. I am responding with fear. And it just becomes so normalized that it's like a fish swimming around in water. It doesn't know it's swimming around in water. It's just there the whole time. And I had just been responding to my symptoms like that since they had ever come on.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point, Chris, to be looking for things that you do relate to, rather than, I think we all have a tendency to think we are uniquely different,
Yes.
and there's, to find the reasons that it's not going to apply or why we're different. But I love how open-minded and curious you were about that, and just sitting and sort of interrogating those things, and your research process, which you seem to have gone about like a military campaign. That's how you became so certain, because you could find the answers as a combination of curable and just Googling, can this be my brain? Can this be a dysregulated nervous system?
That was it early on. But yeah, it was the combination of an explanation of everything that was going on, as I said, that added up. Then the proof came in that when I stopped responding to my symptoms with fear, they were never as bad ever again. I never had a crash that was as bad as I had before ever again. And I never even really crashed badly at all after that. And that was such incredibly powerful evidence. But the combination of those things was all I needed to keep going with the work. But you're so right. Even going from that first Google phase, there was a shift. There's the person who was doing exactly what you were saying. And every human brain does this. We're always going to try and discount this. I wanted it to be a pill. I wanted it to be a deficiency. I wanted it to be a strange thing that when I took a tablet, it would fix and the biological process would change and I would be better. And I would have taken that every single time. The last thing I wanted to do was understand and think about what might be going on in my brain, and how that might be contributing to it. And yet, a couple of weeks later, as quick as that, my process had changed. I was no longer seeking reassurance for symptoms. I was not, trying to test the theory constantly anymore. I was building evidence in a different way. I wasn't Googling and searching reassurance. I was adding to my list of evidence that, oh, this is interesting. I responded in this way and things were better. I wrote down all the times things had improved when I wasn't expecting them to, whereas before I would look for all the reasons they were wrong. When I crashed or felt worse before, I would look for all the things in the past that was the cause. I'd be like, right, what did I eat? What did I do yesterday? And then that process changed entirely as to how I responded. So I can see the old and the new.
And the new, yes. I mean, I don't think we would advise Googling symptoms, but this sort of interrogating with intention definitely seemed to work for you. And I think fear responses can be so sneaky, as you say, it's not obviously fear sometimes. But I think what you shared about the thought, is this my life now? Will I never be able to ski again? Is a form of fear, isn't it? It's a form of meaning making, which
all of those words meant nothing to me. A very simple way that I now look at it is that a symptom comes on, we worry about it. Of course we do. We worry about it. That puts the nervous system further into fight or flight. So the symptom worsens, that we worry about it more, and it becomes this endless cycle. But the word worry meant nothing to me. I didn't realize I was worrying about it. I said, I'm not anxious about my symptoms. I'm not worried about them. I'm not experiencing fear about them. But when it's never going to really resonate. You've just been doing it. We've been doing it so long. It's entirely subconscious. It's just how you almost are as a person at that stage, until you then look at it in a different way. And then I realized, of course, I was anxious. Being anxious is worry in a manner that's excessive or out of proportion. I don't think this was necessarily out of proportion. It's normal to worry when we have these symptoms. It doesn't mean it's going to always be helpful, and we can do it in a very different way. We can respond in a very different way. But of course, I was anxious. I had in a strange form, health anxiety. I was constantly monitoring my health, waiting for the next crash. I was examining every little thing I did, what I ate, what activities I did, every part of it. I was hyper focused. I was fixated on it, and I was trying to fix every element, and that would occupy a huge part of my brain's capacity each day.
When we start connecting the dots in the way that you did, with the science and your symptoms and the nervous system, I'm curious about what sort of connections you started to make and what sort of emotional exploration you did, if any, starting to reflect on your life, or maybe back as far as your childhood even.
I think it makes you see your whole life in a new way. I reflect on everything in a different way, in a way that I hadn't before. You're right. My childhood is something you start by reflecting, and I think I was dysregulated most of my childhood. I had a relatively difficult childhood, and so I think I was dysregulated for most of it, and I didn't focus at school. I was never focused, and I was never really interested in performing. I think I had the ability to perform, but I was never really interested in it. And so when I joined the military, that was the first thing I felt good at. And that was me then trying to prove something to the world. And I think that gave me a huge sense of validation for the first time. So I think I really leaned into that. And again, another personality trait which people talk a lot about in this field is that of perfectionism and overachieving. Again, something I didn't resonate with, but of course I was. At first I said, no, I'm not a perfectionist. And then I said, hang on, to join the Royal Marines alone, thousands of people apply each year, and 30 to 50 or so end up, getting through. And the training I put myself through to go through, to get there and to get in alone, that's probably the sign of a perfectionist, or someone who really wants to achieve something. You really have to want it. And that carried on. I was always trying to achieve something, always trying to prove something to the world. And that's not to say that any of the things you're doing on their own are necessarily bad. All the things I did to extreme, eating healthily isn't bad, training isn't bad, having goals isn't bad, but I'm curious about where they came from. I suddenly started asking myself, well, that's interesting. Why do I always feel the need to achieve? Why do I always feel the need why am I constantly trying to be better, fitter, faster, cleverer? I don't know, trying to improve myself. And as I said, there's nothing wrong with eating healthily. There's nothing wrong with training. There's nothing wrong with having goals or ambition. But we can be curious about where those things come from. And I can see a really clear path now, looking back at my childhood, to my early career, to everything. I can see those traits. And I started first identifying them in myself when I didn't think they were there: the perfectionism, the overachieving, the emotional suppression, the health anxiety, things that we've spoken about. So I think, noticing them was huge, and then being open and willing to explore them was obviously is a prerequisite to making change.
Yeah. Did you do that on your own, or did you have anyone that you were talking to about that?
Largely on my own. By the time in the first few weeks, I'd made huge progress, and I would say I was really 70, 80, 90% recovered. The percentage is neither here nor there, because I was back living life again. And over the next few months, I carried on doing the work, and I'd say I did maybe the deeper work. Responding to symptoms gave me a huge benefit, an early win. The harder work, I think, was doing some of the emotional work, learning. Some things were really quick for me. I within weeks I would be able to recognize these things in myself. But one of them, for example, and most people know this, but emotional suppression is heavily linked scientifically to keeping our nervous system in fight or flight, repressing emotions. And I didn't know. I remember reading that that you feel emotions in your body. I was like, "What are you on about?" No, you don't. They're just things that just annoy you, that just occasionally thoughts that come up, they just bother you a little bit. And I had to learn over a period of months to what an emotion was. I don't know, early 30 something man and Royal Marines Commando trying to feel what anger was in my body. But so I did most of the work. Sorry, I've completely gone off topic. I did most of the work myself, but I did go to see somebody. I was also reading a book that had been really helpful for me and would recommend, called Reverse Therapy, which is a related and mind, body, and neuroplastic approach. Quite an old one, but a relevant one and a good one. And I went to see the founder of that a few times and found it very useful, especially with that emotional part.
Yeah. Yeah, well, there are just loads and loads of questions so that people want to get into various aspects more deeply, Chris. But I just want to take the last couple of minutes to just ask you about your work now and the development of the Freeme app and how that's progressed. I think I met you a little over a year ago, and you had just got to the point of launching Freeme. So tell us a little bit about that endeavor.
It's pretty wild to think back, but Freeme is now, realized recently, is coming up to its second birthday. But it's funny to think back when Freeme first launched. So I'd been recovered for probably the best part of a year, and felt very confident this was going to be sustained, and started working on Freeme. But when Freeme came out, I mean, it was quite basic as an app. It still had a lot of the core program you now see today. But we launched it so quickly and didn't have any time to do any work spreading the word. So it had probably about 20 users in its first month, and very little movement. And fast forward 2 years, it's incredible to see Freeme now, having over 1,000 users every month. I feel like it is. It's incredible to log on every single day and to see people making progress and to see people giving feedback and to have the stats and the data to show that these things work, to be able to hear personal stories. A couple of weeks ago, I went for a few beers with a person who had fully recovered using Freeme, and I mean, what an incredible thing! You think that your life's work is done, and I remember thinking that if I can help one person right at the start, to have helped more than that is genuinely incredible. Yeah, and probably shortly after I met you around a year ago, we launched the world's first mind-body AI chatbot, which is really cool. And I think we had no idea how people would perceive it, whether anyone would have any interest. So it was just a tiny thing in a back end part of the app, and it has been an unexpected success. I think that people find it's just, I think, incredible to be able to go and just ask a question and get an instant answer and get an instant mind body neuroplastic kind of answer or take on a situation. And you can do that probably better in person with with a trained practitioner, but you can't do it at 9 p.m. at night when you're curious about something, and you can't keep bothering them for hours and hours, and you can with ours. So that's been incredible as well, watching people react to that and not knowing that it was going to be a success has been incredible. So Freeme is in a very good place. We are incredibly excited about the future, and we're going to keep trying to work to improve it in every way we can.
Well, we're really excited for you. Congratulations on that. I might just invite you just to mention your just how you would sum up in your key messages, and then I'm going to pass over to Jenny to go through the Q&A.
Yes. Well, I remember writing these a few weeks ago.
A few weeks ago.
I'll remind myself. I mean, the first one I've talked about a lot. How we respond to symptoms is huge, and I think we all recognise it. I think this one is maybe more straightforward than some of the emotional and the deeper work we can do around whatever it is from our childhood to reflecting on patterns and where they might have come from and being curious and everything else. The responding symptoms is I never want to say a quick win, but I think it's something which we can be mindful of quite easily and quickly, and it really matters. And we can be kind to ourselves and react in a way that's more helpful. Any response to symptoms is understandable, but some are more helpful than others. The second, I guess, study the recovered is not the second, is huge, because when you do that, and that was unfortunately for me, it was several weeks into my recovery, and you knock on the door of this world and open the door, and you realize that there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people online that share their story. It's so important we do this. And when you study those people, you cannot help but notice that 80-90%, I don't know, everyone should definitely go and do their own homework and pull together a list of recovery stories and see how many of them attribute it to a mind, body, and neuroplastic approach. And that for me was the final kind of nail in the coffin of the argument. I then knew that I couldn't ignore this. I was like, everyone is recovering in the same way. And maybe that'd be even better if it was slightly earlier on in your recovery story. You said, yes, there was something, I know there's something worth looking at here, because I'm in a room with and 10 people have introduced themselves at the start of the call having recovered in the same way. We might be onto something. The third one, shift away from the physical, is I guess in some ways again obvious, but most people who recover tend to shift away from the physical. They tend to stop worrying so much about their diet. Again, not that we should eat unhealthily, that's not what I'm suggesting, but most people have tried that for years. They've tried every supplement and they then stop looking at that and they focus on something else. And that's a brilliant thing, because it means if that's how you recover, then you don't have to take a supplement for the rest of my life, something I realized. I'm not reliant on anything. I don't need anything else. I am enough as I am to recover. And I say go all in on the neuroplastic approach. You mentioned something earlier, Claire. You said we always want to, we're looking for reason to discount it. And our brain will always do this. Everyone's brain will do it. It's entirely normal. We don't want it necessarily to be this approach. And we will have doubts come up. That's normal. That's going to happen. It's as certain as it going dark. It's going to happen. But by working through those in a productive way, by having evidence logs, by looking for the new things that are more helpful, and focusing on that element, focusing away from the physical, then that's where we have the most success, I believe.
Yeah, couldn't agree with you more. I just always want to underline with people, of course, that we're always, at pains to emphasize that this is not their fault. And, if you had a quick recovery, I think there's lots of questions in the chat about people for whom it's taking longer or they have fear. And we totally get that as well. And often what people need is more support and more community, not necessarily more information.
You're so right. It should be really the first thing we say, but the idea does kind of a way baffle me that it could be someone else's fault, because having been there myself, there's not a person on the planet that would wish that upon themselves. It's the most horrendous thing in the world. But there's a difference, isn't there, between fault and we can twist it to say it's an incredible thing if we can do something about it, and I believe we can. But yeah, it's thank you for making it. I appreciate it.